All right. Hello, everybody. While we're all getting settled in, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I'm very excited about today's program. Before we get started, or as a beginning introduction, I'd certainly like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today and pay my respects to the elders present and emerging. I want to sincerely thank all of you for joining us, for your interest in the Ocean Energy Market Forum. I hope you find it really interesting. I know that I'm really excited today to hear our special guests and some really exciting information about ocean energy. My name is Stephanie Thornton. I'm the cluster manager for the Australian Ocean Energy Group. The Ocean Energy Market Forum was started last year as a way for us to strategically focus about building knowledge and understanding about the markets for ocean energy. And it really is a way for us to gain an understanding of the challenges and the opportunities there are for building market interest and helping the industry to really understand what it's going to take for ocean energy to become a real solution for end users, for a wide variety of different customers. So today I'm really excited because we have some exciting and wonderful guest speakers today from the Dutch Marine Energy Center, who I'll introduce shortly. But our partner, before I introduce them, I want to introduce our special partner, who's the European Business Network, and Marianne Schoen, who will provide a short introduction to what the program is and why they've been supportive of this particular event. So Marianne, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to all and a good morning to our DMEC colleagues in the Netherlands and Austria. Some of you will have come across the EU-Australia Climate Business Network. This is an initiative of the European Commission to connect Australian and European businesses to share policy and practical experience to support their efforts to implement the goals of the Paris Agreement. As part of this knowledge sharing, we're delighted to be co-hosting this market development webinar today with the Australian Ocean Energy Group. As the EU strives to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050, offshore renewable energy has a key role to play in reaching their ambitious targets of 55% emissions reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050. To do so, Europe needs to transform its energy system, which accounts for 75% of the EU's greenhouse emissions. In late 2020, the EU released its offshore renewable energy strategy to increase Europe's offshore wind capacity from its current level of 12 gigawatts to at least 60 gigawatts by 2030 and to 300 gigawatts by 2050. This is complemented by a target of 40 gigawatts of ocean energy and other emerging technologies such as floating wind and solar by 2050. The strategy commits the EU to support a pipeline of 100 megawatts of ocean energy projects in the water by 2025 and at least 1 gigawatt by 2030. And while reinforcing the role of offshore energy in the energy mix, the strategy further emphasises that sustainability, protection of the environment and biodiversity are key principles to underpin all these developments. Other EU strategies for energy system integration and hydrogen also complement the offshore energy strategy and the role of ocean energy, all aimed to create a more efficient and interconnected energy sector. Offshore renewable energy covering several energy sources and technologies, all at different stages of development, each have their own set of challenges and opportunities for both energy systems, marine users, industrial actors and civil society. It's recognised at EU and member state level that to foster and improve offshore renewable energy and facilitate the necessary investment, the development of energy infrastructure, regulatory frameworks, market design and research and innovation, as well as technology, are all equally necessary. It's the work of organisations such as DMEC in advancing innovation, mobilising capital and shaping policies that are key to accelerating marine energy solutions and to realising these range of ambitions. And I look forward to hearing from our colleagues and to an stimulating conversation.
Thank you, Marianne. No, it's very exciting to have a partnership with the EU Business Network. As you said, there's a tremendous amount of activity that is happening in the Northern Hemisphere, and a lot that we can learn and certainly apply and bring to Australia to help us accelerate development of ocean energy in Australia. Before I turn over to introduce the CEO of the Dutch Marine Energy Center, just a couple of housekeeping items to mention real quickly. First of all, even though that this is set up as a webinar and I don't get to see all your lovely faces, this is supposed to be an informal discussion. That was the original idea, is to have an opportunity for discussion and interaction. So in this case, please do use your questions and the chat functions. Send in your questions via the Q&A tab there, so that we can be able to share that, be able to answer your questions, bring those to the forefront, and have some good dialogue. And the second thing I wanted to mention as well is that even though we're scheduled, this is a 1-hour program, and even though we're scheduled to stop at 5 o'clock Sydney time, we, our special guests have agreed generously to stay online and be able to continue the discussion if there's the interest. So we'll consider 5 o'clock as our soft close. Any of you that need to go to leave, feel free to do so at the time, but we'll leave the conference open for continued discussion at that point. So at this juncture, I'm really excited to introduce to you Britta Schaafmeister, who's the CEO of the Dutch Marine Energy Center. And she's been a real dynamic leader and has a tremendous story to tell from the transition of the center from what it started out as in tidal energy research, and now being a major catalyst for market development of ocean energy in the European setting. So with that, I'd like to introduce Britta.
Thank you, Stephanie. And thank you, Marianne, as well, for inviting us to be here at this webinar. We're really happy to share some experiences today. And I will start with a short introduction on DMEC in general. I'm not going into the complete transition. I'll just tell you what we're now. First of all, marine energy, we call it marine energy, not ocean energy, but exactly it's the same power from our rivers, seas and oceans. It's close to our coastal communities, and it's the largest untapped source in the world. And actually we promote it as well because it's complementary to solar and wind energy. You see in Europe, most of the policies are focused on solar and wind, but as Marianne said, we see ocean energy coming up here as well. Our role is to be an international accelerator, and we're specialized in marine energy. And our mission is to accelerate marine energy solutions and the growth of the sector to power our economy in a sustainable way. When we talk about marine energy, there are actually 4 categories. So we talk about wave energy, tidal energy, ocean thermal energy conversion, and salinity gradient energy. I expect everybody to be familiar with these terminologies, so I'm not going to dive in. What we also do is to support some adjacent sectors, which is floating solar energy, and that's mainly offshore then, and floating wind energy, because there are a lot of synergies to find there, also in technologies used and in the parties involved. Then marine energy, Dutch Marine Energy Center. We are accelerating marine energy solutions. We do that by driving innovation. So we advance technologies and products, which means that we support companies to actually mature their technologies, but also to mature their business plan and become commercial investor ready. The second part is what we do is we mobilize investments. That's both public and private, to ensure that people can realize their projects and that they can scale up. The third part is policy. So we support policymakers in making favorable policies for marine energy, but also we help to speak with one voice from the sector. Because I think it's very important that at one point we all start to tell the same story so that it is recognizable throughout the world as well. And the fourth part, and that's actually the focus for today, is markets. How can you actually use those technologies to bring applications to the market? So to really solve the needs of other industries, which is really important. Both Hisham and Benjamin will dive into 2 use cases to explain you how we do that. In general, what we do actually is we'll do all these activities. We are a not-for-profit foundation. We are not government supported. So we actually started or initiated 7 public-private partnerships, mainly funded by European funding. And with that, we work together with 85 international partners and supported already over 125 technology companies worldwide. In total, if you look at all those projects, we mobilized 105 million euros of public and private investments into the sector. And then last but not least, just a short overview of a selection of marine energy developers we supported during the years. It actually starts with early concepts until really demonstration phase. So we try to really support the marine energy developers throughout their development and going into the market. Well, that was a short introduction on DMEC itself. So you see we have quite a broad spectrum, and I'm very excited to well, give the floor to Hisham and Benjamin to make it a bit more practical and give you some examples on what we do.
That's terrific. That's terrific. Thank you, Britta. DMEC is really a dynamic organization, and I look forward to future collaborations as we develop and look at market opportunities for ocean energy, as well as the other, especially policy issues as well. That's certainly an important area.
Likewise.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm anxious to get into the substance of our forum today, so I'm really happy to introduce Hisham Sabir. He's the Business Innovation Manager for DMEC, and I'll let him provide further introduction. So with that, Hisham.
Thank you very much, Stephanie and Britta, for the introduction. Yes, I think today we're going to spend a few minutes talking about how to bring marine energies to the market, and what are the drivers behind that, what are maybe the things to be aware of when entering specific markets. But I think I would like to start with a more general message and a positive note that marine energy is today at a tipping point, I think, when it comes to both capital raise and market entry. We are all aware here, I think, about the potential that marine energy represents. Even the technical potential is something that's hard to overlook, and we're not necessarily positioning marine energies versus other renewables. I think, as Britta said, there's a lot of commonalities and complementarity between marine energies and solar and wind, for instance. Today, there's, I think, more than 3 billion euros that have been invested since the last 10, 11 years. And that has contributed to de-risking the technology, particularly around the tidal, now more and more waves. And we're seeing the general maturity of technologies in the space increase. More projects in the water, more and more capacity. So we're still, of course, at the very beginning of that curve, but I think the outlook is pretty positive. So what we've tried to do in DMEC is trying to find outlets or specialized markets for technologies which are maybe not the obvious utility scale array connected device or marine energy farms, because as with solar before and wind before, it's important, I think, to focus on markets that have very specific characteristics which make marine energy a particularly relevant option. And I've listed some here. Would love to go into a discussion later with you on which of those markets you think are most promising, or which ones you think we should focus on. The size of the distance between those markets and the marine energy is trying to represent how close in time and how feasible that integration is today. And so if you look at, for instance, oil and gas, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes, oil and gas is a pretty serious contender for the integration of marine energies, and it's starting to happen now already. but again, more on that will come later. Islands have always been a player for an interesting option for renewables in their early stages, particularly because of their high price of electricity. Today, there are about 20 million people that live on less than 2,000 islands generating electricity with diesel. So that's, I think, a market that's already a lot of you guys, marine energy developers, are looking into. Ports is a market that was looked at mainly by wave developers for the integration with breakwaters, but I think beyond that, there is a massive transformation today of ports for more electrification, particularly diesel container terminals are now 70% of their electricity comes by diesel generators, and up to 30% of the electricity generated in ports will come from local sources. So if we're able to generate electricity closer to ports, that puts less stress on the grid. Utilities, I think my colleague Ben is going to talk a little bit about that and what is some of the maybe earlier integration possibilities with utilities. Aquaculture is Aquaculture is producing today 50% of our produce, and there's with the needs to go further and further offshore, there's an increasing stress on the power availability. Also, it's particularly in Europe and Australia, there's more and more technology involved, and so access to power is of course a key issue. The other opportunities we identified are around shipping, logistics, and construction. Those are maybe a little further away. Logistics and constructions are also a bit specific because those are larger corporations that see the potential of marine energies and want to position themselves in that space. So not necessarily being a direct customer for marine energy developers, but probably a go-to-market partner. So as I said, we're going to dive into oil and gas and utilities, and the case of utilities will be looked at from the lens of multi-use wind parks, and that's we're going to be with Ben in a few minutes. But before, I would like to talk about the electrification of offshore oil and gas platforms. Today, there are a number of drivers for that electrification, but I think the two of the stronger ones are the financial pressure that's on oil and gas companies to green their operations. That's something that's been particularly true since a year now, with the combined market cap of oil and gas companies dropping versus renewable companies. And so there's also a sense of how is the oil and gas market going to react to that? And one of the answers is by being a lot more by engaging in a lot of green projects. The other big driver for the electrification of oil and gas platforms is the purely financial. There's a very strong move towards increased CO2 taxation. And particularly in the case of Europe here, individual countries are now adding taxes on top of the European baseline. Now, some of the countries you see listed here, for them, oil and gas extraction. Oil extraction is a very strong, important part of their emissions. But naturally, I think all countries, to a certain extent, will that have oil and gas fields, and operators in particular are looking at how to reduce their tax burden, which today is about I think $8 billion collectively every year goes into carbon tax. How do you do that? So there are a number of options to connect platforms to energy sources. So one of them is, of course, a grid connection to the mainland, pulling a power cable all the way from the shore. This quickly becomes problematic given the big distances that oil and gas platforms are now at. If you look at Norway, for instance, there's now a lot of also social pressure on oil and gas companies asking why should the mainland pay for an infrastructure or contribute to an infrastructure or that is used by oil and gas companies. So there's an awareness that's picking up around where is this electricity going to come from if we want to electrify the platform. And wind farm is an interesting contender given the growth of the sector, but marine energies, given the environment that those platforms are in, are becoming more and more of an option. So I want to pause or slow down a little bit here because we're getting into where exactly the opportunity is in oil and gas, and I've split it in two broad categories. One is low power applications, the other one is higher power application, and the reason why is going to be clear in a second. By low power application, I'm talking about end of life situations for oil and gas platforms. Just in the UK and Norway, there's about 100 platforms that are going to go into end of life within the next 8-9 years. So it's becoming a real concern for operators. What do we do to decommission those platforms? And there's one state of the life of those platforms which is particularly interesting. It's an idle state that the platforms are put in before being decommissioned, commonly referred to as the lighthouse mode. And this one has very particular characteristics. It lasts for about 5 years. Platforms stay in that state for about 5 years. But in those 5 years, the platform is just a cost point for their owner. And so there's no energy or oil extracted, no revenue from the platform. And it's the main concern there is how can we shorten that time, but also reduce the cost of owning the asset. There are, on the other hand, regulatory constraints on those platforms, and one of them is the availability of lighting, communication, and sensors on the platform, and those need to be powered. And so the question is, how do you power a platform like this that has fairly low commercial value with a solution that's as robust as possible for a 24/7 power availability? So that's an interesting niche situation, which is going to become pretty important in the next couple of years. And what is also specific about it is a very low power consumption of those platforms. Now, we also have higher power applications, and I'm not going to go in all the details, but we've segmented it in 3 categories: unmanned satellites, small scale and large scale, ranging from 1 kilowatt to about 50 kilowatts. And then the production platforms, which are a megawatt scale. We have megawatt scale electricity requirements. And those will, of course, call for different solutions, obviously. And that what we've done is run an analysis on how those platforms, which solutions are a better fit for which platforms. These are just a few names of players we've identified which have solutions that could answer those needs, and ranging from low power devices to higher power devices. You might be familiar with some of them, but we would love to hear back from you if you think that your solutions are a fit for oil and gas. But what we've seen is that maybe after the last couple of years, where oil and gas where marine energies were developing kind of a generic solution with the idea of connection to utility in a grid scale, in a farm kind of configuration, Now there's a lot of more specialization within the sector, and I think developers understood that certain markets will be easier to address than the general utility markets. So this method of identifying a specialized market and then looking at which solutions are fit there, we've extended that to a number of other markets that I listed earlier. The next one we're targeting is aquaculture, and it's something that we're just starting to look at. So again, there, if you're an aquaculture company or have a solution which you think is a fit for that, we are going to be deep diving into the space in the coming weeks and months. Thank you. This is the information I wanted to share about oil and gas and our market approach. I don't know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Hisham. That was excellent and really exciting. What's particularly of interest, certainly, is that the markets, the case studies that you've just shared, are very relevant to Australia, both oil and gas at both levels, low and high power, as well as aquaculture and other markets. There is a question here in the chat, and the question is: Have you done, or has DMEC done any work to quantify the market potential for each of these markets in terms of megawatt demand? So sort of a cumulative assessment of energy demand.
Yes, of course. I think a little note to that question is when you look at specialized markets, megawatts is not necessarily the right metrics to look at. For instance, if you look at low power application, the value per kilowatt that you'll have is very high because the application is kind of mission critical. So we've done both an assessment of what would be the size of the market for lower power application, where robustness, reliability are some of the key things we're looking into, and for larger scale installation, where gradually and as the bigger you go, the more you start talking about megawatts pricing, but also energy and megawatt hour costs. And so for different players will position themselves in different segments of that market. But yes, this is something that we've tried to look at. Yeah.
Excellent. I actually have a question building on to that. On the flip side, has there been a commercial valuation done of specific market segments?
So if you mean within oil and gas, different segments within oil and gas, or more generally markets?
Just more generally, like if within a particular market sector, whether it's aquaculture, and then isolating or narrowing it down to a specific grouping, has there been efforts to then put a commercial value or economic value or market value to that group for ocean, in terms of ocean energy?
Yes, and I think the first ones to do that are the developers themselves. They will look at which market they want to address with their solution. But when we come in, I think we've also run an analysis of, say, aquaculture has a multi-billion value per year, but only a small section of that is relevant for marine energies, and even a smaller section is addressable with the technology we have today. And so that's the kind of nailing down that we try to do when we go into a new market and assess. Is there something that marine energies could do? And I think shipping, for example, is a nice example. It's a good example because the overall value of the transformation of shipping in the next 20 years is absolutely huge. There's major efforts in energy consumption reduction, while we see a great uptake of shipping globally. But the value of marine energy within shipping so far is pretty limited. And so that's that's why we've kind of put that back a little bit in time, and we're trying to see how would you solve something like this.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I'll take. There's one more question, and then we'll move on to Ben. So the next question is actually two parts. The first one is: are you seeing interest or application in decommissioning oil and gas assets being repurposed for harvesting marine energy? And then is there some indication when the pilot plants and full-scale plants with these applications would occur based on your discussions with the industry, that sector?
Yes, so indeed, I think we call that energy islands. So the decommissioned oil platforms that are reused for either for renewable energy production or for hydrogen production. Yeah, and there, I think Eni, so Eni, the Italian oil and gas company, has pretty ambitious and public plans about where they think energy islands will go. Total is also starting a program around energy islands and the powering of platforms with renewables. Overall, energy islands are still a step further. The easiest thing to do for a corporation in oil and gas is first look at cost reduction and operational and sustainable operations. And so when we talk about decommissioning, the early phases are a lot easier to target. And there we're talking timeframes or like happening now already. We see those integrations happen now. When we talk about energy island, because it's also a new business model, we're looking at a 4 to 10 year time frame before that happens, if we look at different actors in space.
Okay, very good. All right, well, thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation, really insightful. It's a great starting point for lots of discussion and continuing discussion. So thank you for that. There are other, I invite the audience to please keep using the Q&A for any questions you have. And if we don't get to your question, certainly our speakers or whoever it's directed to will be able to respond to your question. So thank you. Now I'd like to introduce Ben Lenner. He's the project portfolio manager with the Dutch Marine Energy Center. And Ben will talk a little, I'll let him introduce himself and talk to you a little bit about and present a summary of what his presentation will be today. So over to you, Ben.
Thanks a lot, Stephanie, and a warm welcome also to everybody in here. I'm very pleased to talk to you today about also another use case we are working here at the Dutch Marine Energy Center. So after Hisham now did his great presentation on the oil and gas industry, I'm a little bit more looking into multi-source offshore energy parks, so really like utility scale offshore energy parks and what we can do there. Let me take you on a bit of a journey. So about a year ago, we started the thought of after we heard many things about multi-use in the Netherlands, especially multi-use of wind and aquaculture, we started a bit of the thought, or we started with the thought that we can maybe also put marine energy together with wind. And we looked around with mainly utility companies because they are, and project developers, because they are the ones who in the end make the decision what will really happen in these kind of multi-use sectors, because they own the wind farms, they own the assets there. So we talked to a variety of wind farm owners and project developers. A few of them you see on this slide. So RWE, Enel Green Power, EDP, Simple Blue Energy, Ocean Wind, Park Wind, EnBW, and many more which are not listed right now on this slide. And our basic idea was, how can we combine, as said before, solar, floating solar with offshore bottom fixed wind, and how can we combine floating wind or bottom fixed wind with wave energy? And with those two ideas in mind, we went towards these utilities and discussed what they would need for making this reality. However, when we started this discussion, the first question, of course, of the utility companies is, why should we do that? So what is the reasoning to actually risk our assets with putting a not that much tested technology in there? And of course, we had an answer for them, because otherwise we would have not been very well prepared. The first thing we said to them is, yes, of course, it is an additional risk. We understand your worries there, but we are looking into it from a different perspective. We're looking into it from a source diversification point. So by adding up the wave energy and the floating wind, by adding up the solar energy and the bottom fixed wind, you can diversify directly at your park. You can build a hybrid park and diversify your electricity production. By diversifying the electricity production, you can balance your grid better. So you can come to so that's of course more from the policy side, an interesting aspect, because you can come to a lowest cost zero carbon system. But also at the same time, and that's of course when the utility companies start to be more interested in, you can increase your revenues. So you can increase your continuous electricity sales, because you can also sell electricity when the wind is not blowing. And as you can see in this graph, so that's actually a graph made by CorePower Ocean together with a consultancy in the US. So that is at the west coast of the US in California, where they compared the actual production of solar, the actual production of wind in gigawatt hours both, and based on buoy measurements, the production of wave here in blue. And what you can see that solar and wind, as we know out of many, many studies, have a quite good complementarity. So this is now just a week of the, I think in July. So they have quite some good complementarity here. And wave, because of the big water body as the Pacific Ocean is, has quite some continuous electricity supply. So this gives, of course, a better business case if you can increase or if you can continuously sell the electricity. And therefore, that was the first argument of just adding those sources at the location. The second argument we brought to the utility companies is, okay, also next to the better revenues, the potential better revenues, it's also a more cost and space efficient utilization. What does that mean? By co-locating, so by putting solar and wind as well as wave and wind very close to each other, you can save on space. I mean, most of you most likely know how these tender processes work. So the government is having an area, a marine area, where they say, okay, we can build an energy park there, wind park at this times, most of the time. So we can build a wind park there. We want to have so and so much electricity. However, if we can add to the wind park in between some floating solar, or if we can add some wave, we at the same time reduce the space needed, and that will help the marine spatial planning. So again, this is a big policy plus there. But it can also be a plus for the utility companies, for the project developers, because by co-locating them, you can also co-use substations. So the same substation built for the wind farm can be potentially upgraded to also host floating solar or to host wave energy. Additionally, the export cable, which is together with the substation, a huge part of the cost of the entire capital cost of the capex of building a new energy park, can be co-used. And we saw that even if we do, for example, floating solar and wind in a 1-to-1 ratio, the cables originally laid down for the wind park is already sufficient. So you don't even need to upgrade any of the cabling there. So that's, of course, a huge benefit in terms of cost reduction. And last but not least, there could be also some benefits on the operational cost if you can co-use your vessels. So that can be for the installation, but it can also be on a later stage when you just operate your system. So these are the benefits we are currently mainly exploring, but we also brought to the utility companies. And the utility companies answered, yeah, sounds pretty decent, but what we want to see and what we want to hear from you or get proven from you is a beneficial business case. And the beneficial business case, of course, consists of the total costs. And here we have devices which have a higher LCOE. We know floating solar is more expensive than offshore wind, and also wave energy is more expensive, and also tidal energy is more expensive at the current stage than offshore wind. So the cost might be higher per device, but the shared infrastructure cost can reduce the total cost again. Again, as I said before, the expected revenue, so the part they earn money on, is definitely to rise because you produce more electricity and you don't necessarily need curtailment. So for those of you who don't know, curtailment means you turn off basically your machine because you cannot export the electricity you produce anymore because of their complementarity. And that leads to electricity being sold at low wind periods, also, which is normally, especially in the area where we are, the Netherlands, the North Sea, where a lot of wind energy is produced already, to better electricity prices, because currently there you need to fire gas power plants. Of course, what they really want to see is also, can the device be insured? So what is the insured premium they have to pay, and what are the risks? So we need to have the system tested and see that this more diverse system doesn't necessarily lead to higher risks there. So that was basically the task. The utility company said we need that, and they also teamed up with us on doing these things. So we are currently actually on checking all these different parts in large-scale demonstrations. And that's also bringing me to the what can we do? What can the ocean energy sector and the policymakers do to make the case for this new technology combination of wind and marine energy? And first of all, let's start at the total cost. The high LCOE of the devices we're talking about is therefore still higher because we just didn't reach the deployment which we need, like the amount of deployments, the size of deployments, to reduce the cost to the same level as wind and solar did. Wind and solar also needed for quite a while to come to this low cost. I mean, I'm talking now, of course, about land-based solar. Offshore solar is also a very new topic and still has quite some learning to do here. And again, also the deployment will increase the reliability of the devices. So we as the sector need to help companies to deploy and to increase their size, increase the reliability. That will help to bring the total cost further down and make the business case more advantageous. On the expected revenue, there's of course something the policymakers can do, which are feed-in tariffs. We have talked to many policymakers over the years. There are quite some countries which have beneficial feed-in tariffs. Just one example is Canada, where you have quite good feed-in tariffs for tidal energy, but also others. And how do you convince the policymakers to give the subsidies to do the feed-in tariffs for the technologies? It's actually you have to talk their language, and you have to give them the reasoning. And the reasoning for policymakers often can come with what is the system cost? What really does it cost to include so and so many renewables into the national grid, into the European grid, into the Australian grid? And what helps there massively are energy system models. So this is another part. We're working hard on getting these energy system models to understand, of course, the cost on the energy system, but also to understand the value these additional newer technologies can bring up. And last but not least, we're on the problem of insurability and risk. There we are also as DMEC very active, and also together with in this project, for example, we are talking a lot about certification. Certification is the basic to get the risk down and make this device insurable. So working here together with certification bodies, we help the technology developers to get the device on the path to certification. And also, which will come or need to come sooner or later, is standardization. We need to have a bit of a standard in the device. It comes very together with certification, and this is quite important. And that will ultimately reduce the insurance cost and risk. So we're on all these parts I was now describing is actually a project, and I started off my short presentation on saying last year we started this. We now are in the process of having some megawatt scale demonstration on that, which hopefully will hit the water in the next 2 to 3 years. And we cannot yet tell you much more about it because we are still in the process of defining it together with the European Union. We know that it's funded, and I hope you all stay tuned before launching that, which is September 1st, where we start the project called European Scalable Offshore Renewable Energy Sources, and where we will demonstrate exactly what I talked about here today: utility scale offshore wind combined with utility scale wave energy, as well as utility scale floating solar. And with that, I'm happy to end my presentation here and take any questions which are coming from the audience.
Thank you, Ben. You just gave us a good idea for the next forum, or future forum, I should say. Sounds like a fantastic topic. We do have a question, and it does follow along on your reference about policy and regulations, or policy in particular. But the question there is, how is policy and regulation contributing to the growth of marine energy in Europe? Is it driving the growth, or is it really the other way around? Is the industry pushing the policy?
So in a European scale, we see that policy making and also subsidies are quite beneficial for the marine energy sector. So that's also thanks to some organizations like the Ocean Energy Europe, and also ourselves, where we provide, of course, feedback to the European Commission on that. So we see a lot of subsidies for developing these technologies further. On a national scale, in some countries, you see a good policy push, like Portugal has quite some good policy push. Ireland also starting off on that, UK very much. I think Britta wanted to add something on maybe on the Dutch situation, because she's more active there than myself.
Yeah, I can do that. I was actually in Europe. There's a very positive regulation, and you see on national level that mostly there are a bit more challenges, because then you look at the energy level or the energy system within your own country, and mostly they look at only focus, mass and cost efficiency, and they forget about the spillovers of the economic growth of a region, and that's where you see there is a discussion we are trying to fuel in the Netherlands, also with facts, and not only to have a discussion on that is good or not good or beneficial, but we're trying to deliver facts to them that they can make an even discussion. So in the Netherlands, they had a report the last year about the potential of marine energy, and we see there is a gap of some information, and actually we're discussing now with the government how to fill that gap, that knowledge gap, in the next 2 years, so that they can actually reevaluate their policies towards marine energy.
That's great, thank you. Well, building on that, I have a question to add on. What do you feel that is the strongest catalyst for getting government support? Unfortunately, in Australia, we don't have very strong support, very little. Of course, the industry is not yet really visible or very dynamic yet, which that's going to change. But of course, getting government, it seems to us, as a catch-22, is we also need government support to help nurture the industry as well. What would you identify as perhaps the 1 or 2 key issues to really get government's interest?
Well, I think it's what Ben already said, talk their language.
Talk.
So, yeah, you need to know what their goals are. If you know their goals, you can fill them with marine energy.
Yeah.
So you need to make the translation of what marine energy has been quite some technology push. And I think now we have to listen more to the market, including governments. Okay, what are their needs and how can we link them? Yeah,
very good point. Ben, did you have some?
So to add on that, as also presented shortly, so I mean, if you talk to them, you also want to present the story not just from your sector view, but you want to have the backup of the universities, the backup of the research institutes on that sense, why it makes sense to do so. And that is basically the data, right? So you need to have their backup on talking to the governments as well, because then you stay as a united front. And that's something where the energy systems comes very handy, because if you have, I mean, they talk only in data, right? Research institutes only can, that's their language, that's a scientific language. So with that in mind, you can make up, or you can come up with a shared strong story.
Very good point. There's another question. What are the constraints currently in terms of private investment and risk? And what is the need for public investment for demonstration projects?
Maybe to start from the what the public investments can do and should do at this stage, I think so if you talk about technological readiness level of wave energy, for example, which is around about 6, 7 right now, there is still some subsidies needed to just get the technology de-risked, right? So that's still the role of the government, because no private investor can take it from at the point of a very or mediocre tier L to a full-scale device in the energy sector where costs are quite high. So there the government has to step in and support it, maybe not with 100% funded subsidies, but with partially funded subsidies, and then the private investor can step in addition to that in. So that's something we see a lot here also with European funding, which is for private companies 70% funded, and then the last 30% are covered by their investors. And that for some companies works really well. However, to get then the large-scale deployments, I would say, as mentioned before, I mean, there is on the way to the really large scale, even if you're already deployed megawatts, you still don't have the learning to get be cost competitive. So also here, the same as Germany did for solar, other countries need to do for marine energy to basically just support this little bit of revenue which is missing, to give them the chance to deploy or to develop the technology a little bit further and to get the learning right, so that they are on the same cost level as wind, solar, whatsoever, and can compete in the sector, not necessarily with wind and solar, but more with gas than when wind and solar is not available.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe to add on, I think a very important part is maybe not even only public investments, but also making the targets. You see that Europe has set targets now for ocean energy, which is actually very interesting for private investors, because then they know there is a long-term strategy and then it will get interesting for them to invest. So also the story we have to our Dutch government is indeed, okay, funding of course is beneficial, but we also, the political commitment is actually more important, because else you won't get private investors in if the commitment changes over the years.
Mm-hmm. And that speaks to a very predictable regulatory scheme as well, so that the investment understands what the timeframes and delivery requirements are going to be.
Exactly.
So yeah, okay, excellent, thank you. All right, and we have another question. This is regarding social license in Europe. As the ocean is being used in so many new and innovative ways, and in many places are starting to look at different or even changed ecology, is there any pushback from society in general? So more of the public view.
I think that there is less pushback. I mean, we are not there to deploy on the scale of wind, right? The pushback comes when you deploy very high scale, but we don't foresee this pushback because, first of all, it's quite invisible. It's more like small little ships out in the ocean, so it's not as a big wind turbine. If you talk about the marine energy, in terms of marine spatial planning, of course, this is always an issue, but that's an issue which can be relieved if you have this multi-source parks, right? Because you optimize the use of the area which is anyhow already dedicated for energy production or electricity production. So there we also see less problems. However, of course, if you have large parks of all kind of sorts, especially in the North Sea where you are already constrained, there's always a bit of a societal discussion going on. But again, here marine energy can actually be of help. And in terms of ecology, the devices as they are built, so there is so far no proven negative effect on the wave devices or on the tidal devices we are working with. So actually quite the opposite. You see that this anchoring and mooring acts as a natural reef. Of course, it leads to a short disturbance, but after that it recovers even stronger because of the new growth area the marine energy devices provide for ecological side. So actually there is quite some positive effects also on that side. So we foresee this actually as a strong point for marine energy in the future energy transition.
That's great. Thank you. Are there other questions? I have 2 more questions coming up, but I just want to invite the audience to keep sending in. We have a few more minutes, about 8 more minutes left. In the meantime, I do have a question for you. And this is for Hisham or Ben, what are the shared design characteristics you see between the solutions that are a good fit specifically for the oil and gas market?
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. I think, as I said, we're seeing developers that now have solutions that are a lot more specialized. And I think if you look at oil and gas, developers that have solutions that are the best fit are maybe those that didn't necessarily focus on LCOE as a key design criteria, for instance, but will have, for instance, robustness as a main criteria, sometimes involving redundancies. So going out of the paradigm that a marine energy developer will build marine energy only solutions and try to kind of complement that with either solar, or very limited capacity of solar, or even limited biofuel capacity. Some others will have a combination of wind, solar, and wave. So I think one of the developers that I saw most successful for oil and gas are those that kind of step back from the idea that from being a mono-focus, mono-source technology provider, and two, that have kind of designed specifically for, if you take aquaculture, for the mooring techniques around aquaculture, if you take oil and gas, for the redundancies and 24/7 power availability. So yeah, I think those are things, yeah, that make those developers a bit better fit for those markets.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you. That's really interesting. And I have one more question. This has to do with the energy parks or energy islands. What time frame do you see these multi-use parks being deployed at the utility scale? Those are pretty exciting concepts, and it's really interesting to see how fast something like that can actually be established and proven.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for that, Stephanie. I think for really this multi-source parks, it's now important to get megawatt scale deployment. So that's also what we are doing right now, and hope to launch or to have megawatt scale deployments in 2023. About in Europe, 2 locations in Europe. And I think if we can de-risk the technologies at that scale, then, because it's also multi-devices then, so that's also of course important. If you have to connect multiple devices, you run into additional learnings you have to do. And after that, 2025, I think we are ready for real having then not just in the single megawatt, but in the tens to hundreds of megawatt scale, 2025 till 2030, so 2025 to 2030, where this would be possible if everything goes all right with all the tests we having planned on that side.
That's very exciting. Wow, that's amazing. And just calling, we have one more question. We still have a few more minutes here. So just the question is interested in seeking some feedback about aquaculture as a market in Europe, and is the aquaculture industry really getting behind this and on board?
I think that's mainly on Hisham.
So I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, it was a question about the aquaculture market in Europe, and how the aquaculture sector is getting on board behind ocean energy.
Yeah, so I think if you compare oil and gas with aquaculture, surely aquaculture is a few, I think, step behind in terms of integration. There's already been a number of attempts to integrate marine energies in aquaculture, but there's a shift happening right now in Europe. And again, if I look at, I'm not talking total aquaculture, because I think there 85% of it comes from Asia. And the dynamics there are very different. A lot of small farms. I'm mainly talking Europe, fish, particularly salmon, North Sea, and then of course Norway is a big player. A number of Spanish also large players. And in that subsection of the market, I think there is a lot of environmental discussion around where the farms should be, and there's a drive for having the farms further and further away from shore. But at the same time, we see, for instance, underwater lighting, feeding technologies, monitoring technologies coming in and becoming more and more prevalent in those spaces, in those applications. And so the question is, where do we get the power from? It's a pretty simple one, and right now there isn't a good answer for that. Because we're moving away, we're kind of pulling that cable with us from the shore, but at some point that's not going to make any business sense anymore. And we're looking at, okay, well, some attempts have been made, for instance, with wave energy converters, others with floating solar, and I'm really excited to see, which solutions are going to prove to be a fit for those markets. But again, the design criteria for aquaculture are very specific. So almost none of the oil and gas solutions we've seen in marine energy as in marine energies would be a one-on-one fit for aquaculture.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Thank you very much.
Maybe Stephanie,
yep.
Stephanie, to add, what you see across all end users actually is that they all have their own specific problems. And I saw a question before, are they genuinely interested? Yes, they are, because if you start to contact with them and actually have a solution for their problem, they are interested in working with you. The only thing is you need to understand what their problems are. And they mostly are not aware of marine energy solutions, that they could offer actually a solution for their problem. So I think it's a lot of creating awareness about what marine energy is, what kind of solutions it can deliver, and also understand your market. What kind of problems does a specific market have, and provide an application for that.
Britta, that was brilliant. That was my closing remarks, and you said it perfectly.
Oh, thank you.
No, I was going to ask you what advice, and just sort of in wrapping up our program tonight, what you advised to us, and that was just perfect, because that's exactly the focus of what we would like to accomplish in Australian Ocean Energy Group, is really drive towards understanding those markets and be able to bring that awareness about ocean energy as a solution, but being able to do it in a way that really provides a connection. So tonight's program, all of you have presented excellent information, giving us some real food for thought in how we can do that. And even more importantly, it's real tangible and it's happening. So it's not just even concept anymore. There's some real progress being made, and I'm quite envious of how much has been done in Northern Hemisphere, and especially in Europe in your work. And I look forward to seeing what we can do in Australia as well. But thank you for sharing this. So I'm going to I don't see any further questions, so I'm going to bring this to a close. First, I'd like to turn it over to Marion just to provide any closing thoughts, and to thank the EU Business Network very much for supporting this and helping bringing us together. So I'll just turn it over to you, Marion, and then I'll close up.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you again, Britta, Hyam and Ben. I think you've really illustrated, certainly for me, the role that policy can provide in terms of incentives both for developers and investment, and I think that's a really important issue, and the setting of targets, how that's really important so that capital starts moving. And I would agree with Stephanie that your conclusions about, what are the needs and how can ocean energy be part of a mix that actually meets those needs is a really important one to keep in mind, as we often just focus on the technology. So thank you very much. And I think we'll certainly be sending out the recording of this webinar to everyone who was here today and those who couldn't join us today, and sharing your insights and your knowledge much more widely within Australia. So thank you again.
Yeah, and likewise, in closing, thank you, Ben, Hisham, and Britta, very much for your time and your willingness to join us. This was really terrific. For the audience, I just want to let you all know that our Market Development Forum is an ongoing program that we will hold these types of events and these kinds of discussions on a periodic basis. But the next one we're looking at, it will be towards the end of September, mid to end of September timeframe. So please stand by. I hope you'll join us on the next one. And with that, I'll bring the meeting to a close and thank everybody sincerely for your interest, engagement, and contributions. So have a good rest of the day or evening. Night, everybody.
Thank you, and thank you for having us.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.